Hi, everyone. It's great to see all your faces. I am Gabriella D'Addario. I'm the Director of U.S. Operations at Paideia, and thank you all so much for coming today. If anyone here is unfamiliar with the work that we do, we're a nonprofit that is dedicated to expanding access to the classical humanities. And the main ways that we do that are through our travel programs. So we bring students to Europe, several times a year to do immersive study of Latin and ancient Greek. We have online programs throughout the year, of which our online lecture series is a part. We also teach synchronous online classes. We have a variety of great outreach initiatives to enable students who might not otherwise come across Latin and ancient Greek to get involved in the classics. And we also develop original curricula that we sell to schools and other independent classicists. So if you want to learn more about our work, please visit our website. There's also a link to donate there if you are interested in supporting us or if you just really like the lecture today. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to let Jason introduce our speaker today. Jason is the president of Paideia. I'm sure many of you know him. So he's going to tell you a little bit more about Walter and this sort of mini lecture series that we have conceived of which this is the first part. So take it away, Jason.
Okay, yes. Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Yes, I'm Jason Petticone, president and co-founder of the Paideia Institute, and very excited about today's lecture, part of a two-part series by two eminent historians and also friends whom I admire, who have nevertheless very different takes on how to define and locate the study of the ancient history, Greek and Roman classics in American academia. Um, uh, I was just lest we think that this question of call it the culture wars or what is classics as a discipline and what should it be, lest we think it's purely theoretical. I was listening just yesterday to the All In podcast. I don't know if you know this podcast. It's a sort of a bunch of tech founders talking about various cultural issues. And Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, was on. And uh, he was talking about the AI arms race. And he was making the point very emphatically that it was important for the West to win the AI arms race. And he put it in a very stark terms. And I thought, man, this is so relevant. This definition of what the West is. Is there still a West? And if so, what are its values and what are its foundations? And I said, well, I'm going to talk about this in my introduction for my lecture tomorrow because it just shows you that this is not theoretical. It's practically relevant, and what Western civilization is and what its foundations are and how we should present them in our educational systems is a highly relevant topic that matters a lot. So I, for one, have always, even though I have obviously dedicated my professional life to the founding and creation of an organization that promotes the study of the Western classics, I have always enjoyed hearing critiques of that tradition. Arguably, this is a Western value, the criticism of our own ideas, uh, and and therefore, I was excited when Walter's book came out to hear about some of his arguments, and I'm equally excited for a civil and also deeply researched and academically serious debate about, well, or at least conversation about both sides of these issues. So I hope you'll all also attend Jim's lecture. Jim Hankins, professor at Harvard and author of The Golden Thread. Um, later this week. I believe that's on, is that Thursday, Gabby?
Yeah, Thursday at 7 Eastern.
Thursday at 7 p.m. And these lectures will both be recorded. Um, okay, so without further ado, I will then present our first speaker, Professor Walter Scheidel, Dickinson Professor in the Humanities and Professor of Classics and History at Stanford. Walter is one of the most searching and provocative voices in our field, and his scholarship ranges widely from Roman demography and inequality to comparative world history. And his most recent book, What is Ancient History, published by Princeton University Press in 2024, asks us to consider whether classics as traditionally conceived can or should survive at all. Whether one agrees or not, Walter compels us to revisit first principles, and that makes him the perfect person to open this dialogue. So with that, Walter, take it away.
Well, thanks, Jason, for your invitation and to everybody for showing up on a Sunday, which is maybe not that common, but I'm glad we have such a good turnout. So since I wrote this book, I should probably begin by trying to answer the question, what is ancient history? It seems to me there are two different kinds of answers. One, that in a literal sense, ancient history is part of history, something that happened a long time ago. And then you have the colloquial sense, which goes back almost 200 years. When we say that's ancient history, we are trying to dismiss something as obsolete and irrelevant. And I'm going to talk about both meanings, but let me start with the first meaning. How is that ancient history as part of human history more generally usually defined? Now, if we want to know anything these days, we go to Wikipedia. So we consult Wikipedia about this. And Wikipedia says, ancient history covers all continents inhabited by humans in the period from 3000 BC to 500 AD, which is slightly revolutionary because the global scale is not something that's ordinarily associated with ancient history. I'll get to that in a moment. But there's also a strange tension there between the planetary scope, all continents inhabited by humans, and the start and the end points, which is the beginning of writing in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and the unraveling of the western half of the Roman Empire, which are of no particular importance for people in other continents in this particular period. So there's a tension between the global scale and absolute chronology, which is quite important. It's something I'll get back to in a few minutes. In practice, of course, ancient history is usually much more narrowly defined. It is either implicitly or explicitly equated with Greece and Rome, or Greece and Rome and its immediate neighbors in space and time, which I like to call Greece and Rome plus. That's very easy to document. There is a famous multi-volume Cambridge Ancient History in various editions that covers exactly the Greco-Roman Mediterranean, Egypt, West Asia, and that's it. An encyclopedia of ancient history, a journal of ancient history, an ancient history bulletin, and there's an association of ancient historians for the US and Canada, which again deals with Greece and Rome, and only very recently added in the immediate neighbors. And it's not just a feature of the Anglosphere. If you look at other Western languages, you have journals, publications for Alte Geschichte, for Histoire Ancienne, for Storia Antica, for Historia Antigua. It's always the same thing. It's either Greece and Rome or Greece and Rome plus. Now, this may seem natural, of course, that in a European Western academic tradition, that's how ancient history is defined. But it's certainly worth pointing out it wasn't always like that, and not even in Western Europe itself. Of course, there had always been a strong emphasis on Greece and Rome for any number of reasons. They were the best known ancient cultures. They had inhabited the same space, and there were all these various cultural lineages and legacies to consider. But ancient history wasn't really constructed in this exclusionary way. You can go back hundreds of years to humanists like Scaliger, who was interested in Greece and Rome, of course, but also in the Hebrews and Arabs, tried to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs without success, but the interest was certainly there. If you look at general accounts of ancient history in the 18th century, authors routinely cover everything that they knew about the entire ancient world, which wasn't very much by our standards because of the limits of knowledge at the time, but they would certainly include North Africa, Egypt, West Asia, all the way to Iran, maybe India, if you were lucky. If you look at Johann Winckelmann, the Romanticist, one of the founding figures of what we might call classics, even he, and a great champion, of course, of Hellenophilia, even he began his history of art and antiquity in 1764 with the Egyptians and the Phoenicians and the Persians and the Etruscans and all kinds of other people. And it had always been universal history from the 17th century onwards, in particular. In the late 18th century, you get attempts in Germany by people like Schlötz and Gatra to write a world history on a truly planetary scale. And since they always started at the beginning and never really got very far, what they produced in effect was a series of globalized ancient histories, looking at all of Eurasia from the Atlantic to the Pacific and what little they knew about Africa and even sometimes the Americas. All of this came to an end roughly 200 plus years ago, around 1800, for a number of reasons. Professionalization, specialization, which of course covered all fields, not just the study of the past. But in the case of ancient history, there were more specific factors that came into play. The essentializing of the nation and an explicit upgrading of Greece and Rome relative to other early cultures that became increasingly well known with the decipherment of the hieroglyphs and cuneiform and the early translations of Sanskrit texts and early Chinese texts and so on. That, of course, resulted in the creation of what the Germans would call Altertumswissenschaft, the science of antiquity, or later on, fully fledged classics. There were many participants in this process. I like to cite Friedrich August Wolff, who was exceptionally influential in Germany, and Germany as a whole was exceptionally influential with respect to other traditions in this period, the creation of the modern research university, discipline formation, and so on. And he in 1807, when he finally wrote down lectures he had been giving for quite a number of years, said, well, it would be really nice if we could put all the various ancient cultures side by side and study them side by side, but it's a bad idea for three reasons. A, the Greeks and Romans are better than everybody else. They're the only ones who have a genuine high culture, whereas everybody else is just civilized. Secondly, we don't really know enough about the other cultures. And thirdly, if we put them all together, it would create a big mess. You'll notice the tension, the logical tension between claims 1 and 2, because if you don't know that much about the other cultures, how can you be so sure that the Greeks and Romans are extra special and better? But leaving that aside, this leads him to conclude that, I quote, we are permitted to restrict even the term antiquity in an exclusionary manner to the two peoples, Greeks and Romans, that were refined by the intellectual culture, learning, and art. Now, you could legitimately say that was back in 1807. That's water under the bridge. Who cares what some German said more than 200 years ago? It's proverbial ancient history, right? It's become irrelevant and obsolete. Well, that's not actually true. Because whenever we encounter ancient history in a conventional sense, departments, programs, journals, associations that label themselves ancient history, ancient historical, well, they follow the same template. Through path dependence, that template is still very much with us. They would still deal either exclusively with Greece or Rome or center it very heavily, even when other ancient cultures get to be involved. It's a template that has never actually been updated. And that's the reason why this particular kind of stunted ancient history fits really neatly into the template of Greco-Roman classics. They really join at the hip. They're essentially two sides of the same coin. Now, I think it's fair to say that for most people, which is to say people who don't attend Paideia Institute lectures on a Sunday, ancient history means something else, which is the colloquial meaning. It was a long time ago and who cares? It's irrelevant and obsolete unless it involves aliens, built pyramids, and that sort of thing. Nothing could be farther from the truth, but my argument is that in order to demonstrate just how relevant, how foundational ancient history really is, we need to approach it differently from the way we are usually doing it on a genuinely global scale. Now, that immediately brings us to various problems of definition and delineation. Where does ancient history begin? Technically, it starts with the Big Bang a long time ago because everything is ancient history, early history. You could have it start with Homo sapiens, going back 300,000 years. Usually, we start with the earliest instances of writing, which is something that made a lot of sense about 200 years ago, when the idea of prehistory began to appear for the first time, that there are cultures out there that were pre-literate or non-literate, and they were succeeded by quote unquote proper historical societies that proper historians could study in depth. It made a lot of sense then because there was hardly any archaeology. It makes considerably less sense now because we have learned a lot from archaeology. We have figured out various ways of finding out a great many things about pre or non-literate cultures. But of course, the focus on writing was always part of a bigger preoccupation with what we might call civilization, focusing not just on literacy as such, but on urbanism, on state formation and high culture, all the stuff. If you go to a museum, all the stuff that is prominently displayed in the vitrines and in the early forms of these manifestations of civilization. So I think it's fair to say that ancient history has always been defined by its reference and its relevance to us. We live in a world that is governed by literacy and cities and states and high culture and all the rest of it. And that's why we find those particular segments of the past particularly interesting. And then, of course, there's an element of convenience. It's simply easier in some ways to study literate cultures, those that have left a written record, than others. And again, this is really about us, what we prefer to do, what we find easy or difficult to do. Now, in principle, that's just fine, because at the end of the day, everything necessarily has to be about us, because we are people who are currently alive, and our engagement with the past or anything else is shaped by our own concerns. That's ultimately inevitable. But even if we embrace this principle, in order to do justice to just how foundational the ancient world really was, ancient history needs to be made broader and approached in a more flexible way in terms of both space and time. I will set out the reason for this in a moment, the idea being that the creations of the ancient world, of ancient history, completely surround us. They shape our bodies, they shape our minds, our lives, our experiences, our expectations. We are entirely trapped in the creations of this particular phase of development. And those are conditions, those are features that didn't always exist. Most of these things, and I'll get to that in a moment, didn't really exist before the end of the last ice age, the last interglacial 12, 13,000 years ago. They were mostly created during the Holocene and primarily during the last few thousand years. And that in turn became the foundation of our entire world, not just particular parts of the world, but the world overall, our entire species. Now, there are, of course, many things that make us human in a recognizable way that are much older than the Holocene: walking on two legs, brain growth, tool use, fur loss, control of fire, cooking. All of these things happen way before Homo sapiens appears on the scene. And even within a long history of our own species, pre-Holocene humans developed language, art, clothing, baking, ceramics, projectile weapons, musical instruments, lamps, funerals, and all kinds of social arrangements we can't actually see in the material record, but we can assume existed. Yet, with the Holocene, with the stabilization of climate around the globe, both the scope and the pace of innovation increases quite dramatically. And I could now fill my entire talk with examples of what that involved, which I don't really want to do. I could refer to the shift to the food production, which is developed independently at least 11 times in different parts of the planet: farming, herding, mining, metallurgy, alloys, steel, use of coal as fuels, village life, which goes on for thousands of years, giving rise to cities with their own unique opportunities and challenges. You create a city, you also create the countryside that didn't meaningfully exist before. Literally all the physical infrastructure that surrounds us, the chair I sit on, the desk that my computer sits on, the window I look out of, walls, roofs, stairs, you name it. I could give you a really, really, really very long list. None of these things existed before, as far as we can tell. They were all developed at this particular juncture. The same is true of smaller gadgets, of all the things, the objects that surround us. We have upgraded versions of these innovations, but they are organically the products of that particular period. And those, of course, are just the visible creations, to which we have to add the social and cognitive ones that are at least as important as consequences of sedentism, of farming, of herding, of property rights, the domestication of humans, if you will, alongside the domestication of plants and animals that created previously unknown synergies, hierarchies, interdependencies, inequalities. All the political systems we are used to are created effectively in this period, from autocracy to direct democracy, organized warfare, diplomacy, taxes, coins, credit money, shares, banks, long-distance trade, formal division of labor, jobs, wages, social classes, a distinct elite culture, and mature patriarchy, where it does in fact manifest in different parts of the globe. Literacy plays a major role in this, with all its consequences, accounting first, then literature, the creation of literary genres, the formation of canons that, you're also familiar with. Schools, formal schooling is not really possible before this period. Mathematics essentially relies on these innovations: abacus, multiplication tables, algebra, geometry, theorems, proofs. All these things appear for the first time at this stage of development. Belief systems, if you think of religions, new religions that reshape the divine in the human image, if you will, reflecting newly formed human hierarchies, moralizing gods, transcendent world religions, all the major philosophical schools, whether it's the Greeks, whether it's the 100 schools of thought in China, and any number of other things in between. So I could go on and on and on and on, but it's pretty clear that we still inhabit the world created by all these various innovations. What's important about this is that all of these things were essentially completely new. And it's at least as important to note that they're all bundled together. They don't exist in isolation from one another. They are packaged in ways that are not identical, but recognizably similar in different parts of the world, including in parts of the world that had no contact with one another, if you think of Afro-Eurasia and the Americas. That, I would argue, is the real ancient history. That's the ancient history, that's the antiquity that created the world we inhabit today. Everything is fancier, it's spiffier, it's much upgraded, but it is deep down essentially what was created for the first time in this period. There are various counter-arguments. Not everything was new, but the packaging certainly was novel. It's important to bear in mind these developments are not linear. There are lots of detours and dead ends and all the rest of it. But in the long run, everything moves in only one direction, developmentally in different parts of the world. It's true that these changes occur at different times in different places, first in West Asia, then in northern China, then in northern South Asia, and later in the Americas and Mesoamerica and the Andes, later still in sub-Saharan Africa. And in some parts of the world, they don't occur at all, like at the Arctic Circle or in the interior of Australia for ecological reasons above all. But cumulatively, they do occur a lot, interdependently or independently, and cumulatively really transform the world. Now, we are welcome to attach value judgments to this. We can call it progress. It would truly be fair to say, because there's a huge increase in human capabilities, of our ability to manipulate the environment and manipulate other people and understand the universe. We can also see it as a form of entrapment, that we become entrapped in those creations, because as these bundles form and harden, they effectively close off alternative ways, alternative life ways, alternative ways of organizing people and resources. They put all of humanity in the end on a particular trajectory of development that we are still on, and we have no plausible way of deviating from in any dramatic fashion. That's an ancient world that is clearly very, very important. We probably shouldn't call it ancient, because at the time everything was new, called the New World, but that would be misleading. We shouldn't refer to our engagement as ancient history, and it can't be new history either. Maybe foundational history, if we need a new term, an alternative term, would work reasonably well. The phase we are looking at is foundational because it's in our bones, quite literally, in our brains, and we have no way of transcending it. Now, the question is, when did this ancient history take place more specifically within the Holocene? And there is no obvious, maybe that's the wrong question to ask. The Wikipedia approach to say ancient history is global, well, that's just fine, but it has a start point and an end point that is rooted in the history of a particular part of the world. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There is a single ancient history in the sense that it describes certain innovations and the bundling of innovations in different parts of the world, but at the same time, there are different ancient histories, if you will, that play out similarly but differently in different in different places at different times, spread out over millennia, if you look at the entire planet. So it's not actually possible to globalize our engagement with antiquity, with the ancient world, whilst adhering to absolute chronology. That's something we really need to break out of. There's just no way of matching up those two things. So what's the alternative? The alternative would be to think of antiquity, of ancient history, as a phase of development. Well, these innovations are created, put into place, institutionalized, bundled together, and become gradually dominant. The problem is the moment I start talking about developmental phases in any kind of academic or humanities audience, there will be immediately concerns about whether I'm trying to return to the stage models of early anthropology that were promoted in the late 19th century, where you had clear progressions from savagery to barbarism to civilization and all the rest of it. That carries a very heavy toxic baggage of racism, colonialism, and so on. And yet, even though this is a very heavy baggage, there's no intrinsic reason for why thinking in terms of developmental phases needs to entail value judgments. It's very tempting, I understand, but it's not actually part and parcel of this particular approach. And since this seems to be the only real alternative to hanging on to absolute chronology, which is just not possible on a global scale, some form of developmentalism would be the best pathway to a genuinely planetary ancient history. The result, ideally, would be an ancient history that is global in scale, that manifested at different times in different places, that was common but not universal, but which overall, over time, revolutionized the existence of our entire species, and which through its persistence created the foundations and the realities of the present. So this sounds very grandiose. An obvious question is, how would this work in practice? So I have a whole chapter in my book where I talk about the more pragmatic side of implementing a program like this. Needless to say, scholars are specialists. They need to be specialists. We need specialized expertise because there's so much to know, so many different methods and techniques. But that by itself does not preclude globalizing engagement. For pretty much any small-scale, detailed, localized study you can think of, it ought to be possible to frame it in a wider way of embedding it, contextualizing it in more necessarily planetary scale, but wider trends, patterns, and dynamics, which I should say is standard practice in more recent history. If you study more recent history and you do a detailed local case study, you are essentially expected to do just that. If you do the same with respect to the ancient world, you aren't really, but you might be, and you might actually benefit from this wider awareness. Other techniques would be a greater focus on connectivity over space, over time. Spatial connectivities are in fact becoming increasingly popular. They do serve to destabilize established fields that are bounded spatially, geographically, if you can show flows of not just goods, but information across the boundaries of these formalized, institutionalized units. Comparison is something that is grossly undervalued, I believe, among historians as opposed to the social sciences. It's far more common among political scientists and economists who are historically minded. Comparison has the advantage that we don't depend on connections that existed already in the past. We can make them for ourselves in our own brain. We can pick and choose. We can relate cases for analytic purposes. And here, the whole world is our oyster, so to speak. We can really go out and implement a globalizing agenda. Of course, at the end of the day, as I already said, we all need to be specialists one way or another. So the question is, how do you organize this kind of enterprise? A big problem in this is what I like to call heroic individualism. If you think of the academic humanities, every step of the way, whether it's teaching, training, credentialing, hiring, promotion, you name it, efforts are assessed at the individual level, which stands in very stark contrast to lab-based fields, some of the social sciences, and so on. It's even something that not all the people who study the ancient world necessarily do. If you think of archaeology, archaeology is by necessity a collaborative field. You could take a shovel and go out and start your own dig, but you wouldn't get very far. It is a collaborative exercise, and yet in terms of all these other things, assessment, hiring, promotion, and so on, people are forced into the individualistic template that is so dominant in the humanities. That's obviously a big problem for any kind of broader perspective that would necessarily involve a fair degree of collaboration among experts in pursuit of larger questions. But right now, even if people were interested in doing that, the academic reward structure, the incentive structure that has been in place for a long time, is not conducive to this kind of approach. You could say it's actually actively opposed to that, lip service to the contrary notwithstanding. So the call is for what we might call a modernization, if you will, of the study of the ancient world in a lot of different respects. With respect to content, moving beyond essentialized national contexts, beyond individual cultural, civilizational lineages. With respect to time, breaking free from the constraints of absolute chronology, operating in a more flexible fashion, and also with respect to space, taking the planet, at least ideally, as the basic unit of reference, and as a corollary of this, also with respect to actual practice in promoting more collaborative styles of engagement in teaching, in learning, in research, and so on. So I could end here, but I don't want to end here because I don't want to disappoint people who would like to hear a little bit more about the field of classics. Because then the question is, well, how does all of this square with the continuing existence of classics as an academic field? If we were to move in that direction, what would that mean for Greco-Roman classics? Now, let me be very clear up front that there is, as far as I can tell, no plausible global ancient history in which Greece and Rome do not play a major role. That's inevitable for a number of reasons. Greece and Rome are exceptionally well documented compared to many other ancient cultures. They are uniquely deeply studied. I think L'Année philologique, the big bibliography in our field, lists over 1 million publications on Greece and Rome over time. That's a lot of depth for two ancient societies. And of course, Greeks and Romans have been very influential, not just in Europe, but because of European expansion over the last 500 years, again, on a planetary scale. For all these reasons, Greeks and Romans will always occupy a very prominent position in any kind of globalized ancient history. The same is not necessarily true of classics as a field, as an institutionalized way of engaging with a particular sliver of the past. It should be quite clear logically that any exceptionalizing framing of the study of one particular part of the ancient past would not sit well with a global perspective. Now you could say it doesn't really matter. If it's only about history, who cares what some historian like me thinks? Maybe there are very compelling reasons for classics to exist as an academic field, as a way of organizing the teaching, the study of the ancient past. I have a whole chapter in my book that I would encourage you to read and disagree with, where I question this particular position. There are various justifications on offer, explicitly or implicitly, for maintaining the status quo of the Anglosphere, in particular, of maintaining classics as a discrete academic field or discipline. One is exceptionalism, of course, the claim that the Greeks and Romans are so important, so special, that they deserve their own field. There are two problems, as far as I can tell, with this line of reasoning. One is that this claim by itself can only be established and sustained through systematic comparative assessment. In order to make that claim, you have to look at all the other ancient cultures, not in passing, but systematically. That's something very difficult to do if you double down on the format of classics. It would be much easier to do in a more globalized academic environment. And if it turned out to be true that the Greeks and Romans are worthy of special attention, whether in Western countries or more globally, well, then they should have a maximal presence across as many fields as possible. They should have a strong position in history, in literature, in philosophy, in art history, in linguistics, in political science, in any number of fields to which they can contribute. The last thing you should want to do is to relegate them, to silo them off in a single academic department, where it could, in principle, be siloed off and marginalized and ignored, and maybe even cut in the next round of cost cutting. Another line of reasoning is something I call organicism. The idea being you can't break up classics because in order to understand any one part of the Greco-Roman world, you have to know about all the other parts as well in comparable measure. Again, there are two problems with this. A, it's just not true. If you look at continental Europe, classics as we know it in the Anglosphere pretty much no longer exists, except for a few exceptions. The study of Greece and Rome is organized very differently, and yet scholars in continental Europe produce the majority of all scholarship on Greece and Rome without being technically, formally classicists. So it is simply not true that if you remove the template, you kill off the study of Greece and Rome. And even in the Anglosphere, it's fair to say, especially in larger programs, the ones that train the next generation, the PhD students, the holistic principle is mostly honored in the breach because specialization creeps in a lot and effectively fractures these nominally holistic organicist programs. A third approach would be what I call pragmatism, which is superficially quite appealing. The idea being at times of pressure, of financial cutbacks, that sort of thing, the best thing to do is to not rock the boat, right? To try to maintain the status quo at all costs. Again, there are, I think, two issues with this. One is it's an approach that is devoid of any kind of intellectual agenda. And more importantly, it might actually put the field in the position of the proverbial slowly boiling frog, where you hold on to the status quo until you're fully cooked, and then you're really done for before you notice, instead of seizing the initiative, trying to be proactive, trying to reconfigure what you are doing in anticipation of future pressures. Now, of course, there has been a lively discourse about how to sustain some version of classics through reform. I just want to touch on two flavors of reform. One is what you might call progressive reform, leading to something like critical ancient world studies. If you took those approaches seriously, you would end up with something that would no longer be recognizably Greco-Roman classics as we know it. That might be good, that might be bad. I don't want to pass judgment. It wouldn't save classics, it would actually transcend it. It's also an illusion that the embrace of reception studies can somehow sustain classics as an institutional template. You don't need classics as currently configured to engage in reception studies. It can be done in history and literature programs just as well, or arguably maybe even better. Another strategy is what I call expansionism. The idea being that, well, if it's no longer enough to just focus on Greece and Rome, maybe we should co-opt some other ancient cultures to shore up these departments, these programs, and the field overall. If this takes the form of just cosmetic change, where you still continue to center Greece and Rome, and you maybe rename your department from classics to ancient Mediterranean studies, it doesn't really make a difference. You haven't really changed anything substantively. If, on the other hand, you employ this approach in a more radical fashion, what you're going to end up with is some kind of global classics, where you take the major canonical traditions of the old world, from the Mediterranean to East Asia, you put them side by side, you deal with them through their connection, and especially comparatively, which again would require a certain degree of collaboration in both teaching and research. That's fine with me. That seems to be a promising step forward, but it would once again transcend Greco-Roman classics. It wouldn't actually preserve it. It would put something else effectively in its place. So in short, I believe it's not just a global ancient history of the kind that I have in mind that has no need for classics as an institutionalized organizational template. It has a lot of need for studying Greece and Rome, but not in the format of classics. I believe the same is true for our continuing engagement with Greece and Rome as such, which is something we might consider doing in a different way than the way that has been dominant in English-speaking countries in particular now for quite some time. So I think with this, I've taken up all the time that I was given by the organizers. So I would like to thank you for your attention, and I brace myself for your critical feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Walter. Appreciate that, and a lot of interesting food for thought. I am going to, before we open things up to the broader audience, I'm going to take advantage of the opportunity to let Professor Hankins respond. Jim will be giving the partner lecture in this series later in the week. So let me see if I can find you here among the participants. There you are. So I will, I guess I'll ask you to unmute because that's the only option it gives me. The working, Jim?
Yep. Can you...
Yeah.
Okay, good. So 10 minutes, 5 minutes?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. 5 to 10, something like that. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm aware that as the defender of classics in this role, I will be cast as a troglodyte by some. So I just want to say that I have been very interested in cross-cultural comparisons for a long time. I've given a course for 2 decades called Care of the Soul, in which we compare traditions of moral self-cultivation across the ancient world, from Greeks and Romans to Hindic civilizations and Buddhist and Confucian civilization. And more recently, I've been involved in the Harvard Global Institute. We sponsored a study of comparative meritocracy between China and the West, and I constantly go to China, maybe too often for my health, go to China, and I'm involved with various Confucian institutes over there. So I am very, I don't want to say ever that the Latin and Greek studies, which I favor, are inconsistent with comparative study. I share with Professor Scheidel I consider comparative history extremely valuable. I teach it to my graduate students, and I do it myself. I actually agree with a lot of what Professor Scheidel has said. I also bridle at the dismissive use of ancient history as a plea to ignore it as irrelevant, when in fact it's highly relevant. And I certainly agree with what he said about how the past is with us still, and we need to know it. I disapprove of this whole rhetoric of distancing that he speaks of his book. In fact, it's foundational and the opposite of irrelevant or superseded. And I think it's very important to reassert this because our society is becoming historically shallow. And even the American Historical Association, I did analysis sometime comparing the 1995 program with the 2025 program of the American Historical Association. It's very obvious that the ancient past, the remote past, the deep past is disappearing from our studies. So we need to reassert that we are older than the ancients, as Francis Bacon said, and we can learn from them. So, and I also like his approach to studying developmentalism in an asynchronic way, especially as developmentalists often exclude the idea of decline and corruption, which is also possible. And I found myself in strong agreement with his statement in the book that the humanities need to be reframed and reorganized to secure its place in the academy and public imagination. And I'm going to suggest in my own lecture on Thursday ways that could be done, following the path of reform laid out by the ancients and by Renaissance scholars. And I also want to say that I find Professor Scheidel's research vision to be very attractive. I would be very interested in reading books about this. It's something he wants to make universal in classics departments, and perhaps following the model of the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, institution that I admire. He praises as well. However, I think there's a better way to study this sort of things than Professor Scheidel suggests, and one that doesn't really affect classics. But I want to say a little bit about my own experience in history department at Harvard for 40 years, because it gives me some doubts about the practical wisdom of dismantling the classics. So what's going on in classics department today went on in history departments 25 years ago in the 1990s. We decided to globalize, do away with Eurocentric history, and to study, it was initially called transnational history, and then it became global history, international history, and we were trying to do away with national histories. So the first things that happened was that ancient history was spun off to the classics department. When Ernst Badian and Christopher Jones retired, they were not replaced. It was thought that the classics department could take care of that. And when the philosophy department wanted to get rid of ancient philosophy, it sent it off to classics. So in our department, since the year 2000, we have not hired a single European historian at the senior level since 2007. We have lost 8 senior historians. And so my fear is that European history has been hollowed out, and that might happen to the study of Greek and Latin literature if we were to follow the same strategy in classics. The other experience of mine that I would bring up is having edited the Tati Renaissance Library for 25 years. We just published a 100th volume in the spring. And I discovered early on, I'm sorry to say, that PhDs in classics from major programs were unable to translate simple sentences or simple passages in Latin from 15th century sources for which there were no translations and which there was no commentaries or grammars or dictionaries. So I started out believing that every classicist could translate Latin well, and I discovered that that skill was actually rather poorly distributed in the world. I'm not trying to criticize classics education. Well, perhaps I am, but it seems to me that we have a problem in classics with people, classicists, professional classicists, not knowing Latin and Greek well enough. This is, my opinion is reaffirmed by many people that I know in the classics business, the classics departments, that we're facing a decline in the knowledge of classical languages. So what needs to be taught? If you were going to start an ancient studies without borders, as Professor Scheidel recommends, for starters, you'd have to know Latin and Greek well, but you also would need Sanskrit and classical Chinese, plus all of the other languages, Old Altaic, Old Norse, Pali, ancient Japanese, Old Korean, if you're going to do a really global history. And I don't think AI is going to help us that much with those studies. They'd also have to, of course, master archaeology. So you would be in a position of trying to expand knowledges of classical language at the very time when classical languages are declining in universities anyway. It's a different story in K-12 education where they're going a renaissance. It seems to me that Professor Scheidel is like somebody whose house is falling down and decides to build a couple new wings on it without repairing the old house. Now, the weak part, it seems to me, of Professor Scheidel's argument is to claim that global and planetary study of ancient or foundational civilizations can't be realized without getting rid of traditional classics. He says that the classics, the structure of classics departments will prevent any study of world civilizations, or he would probably say world cultures or world societies and their origins. I don't think this is really the case. He has a kind of prejudice against the tradition of classics. He says that classics, I'm quoting, is frequently and justifiably criticized for its intrinsic Eurocentrism, elitism, historical associations with white supremacy and colonialism. The field of classics is deeply flawed and obsolete. It's morally tainted by its past. I think this is a kind of essentialism, the idea that origins are destiny. I don't think that's borne out by any sort of historical study. I have known people in classics, classical languages, classical literature for over half a century, and I've never yet met any white supremacists or neocolonialists. I guess some of us are Eurocentric by preference and by training, but not because we have a belief in the intrinsic superiority of Western civilization over Chinese culture. I think most people would deny that. There seems to be a kind of political or moral hostility to classics that's built into his critique of it. Perhaps that's unfair. Anyway, I need to wind up, so I will just say that I agree that the study of classics needs reform, and I'm going to address that in my lecture on Thursday. My counter suggestion is that we would be better off bringing ancient history back into the study of history, taking it out entirely of classics, or at least anything other than the study of the ancient historians out of classics, and bringing it into history departments again, because history departments need ancient history. They've been allowed to hive it off, and I think history departments are where this should be done, because what Professor Scheidel is talking about is doing actual history, not history from the point of view of philology, but history in the way that it's understood in history departments. And I think history departments need classics, or sorry, they need foundational history such as he describes. And I think also that these ancient studies need to be linked with later histories. We had a proposal to hive off medieval studies a few years back from one of our medievalists. And I think that this is equally foolish, that we need to have history departments that have a much broader global take. And I think, in fact, that today history departments would be very receptive to an ancient history that was global in scope. So, all right. So I will talk on Thursday night about what I think should be done in classics. And I think that Professor Scheidel is correct that they can't go on boiling like a frog in the hot water. We should be jumping out and jumping into some fresh water. But I will leave that till Thursday night.
Okay, thank you, Jim. And in the interest of time and giving a few other people a chance to ask questions, Walter, I'll ask you to sit on your response to Jim's response until Thursday, when you'll have an opportunity to reply to what Jim just said. Though, of course, if you want to address any points he made in your responses to other questions, feel free. All right. So at this point, if anybody has questions, you can ask them in the chat, or if you'd like to ask it live, you can raise your hand and I will unmute you. Okay, I see Rain has a question, so I'm going to unmute her. There you go.
Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Perfect. So I have a couple of questions that are kind of interlinked with each other. My first question on the issue of dwindling classics is it a supply or a demand issue? And that is there too few high school and undergraduate students interested in the classics, or is it that universities are no longer interested in classics, or is it a bit of both?
That's a really good question. It depends on what your referent is. If you compare it to 100 years ago, it's clearly less demand in a way. I mean, because of the downgrading of the position of the study of Greece and Roman society overall. If you compare it to more recent cohorts, it's a really good question. It's not limited, I should say, incidentally, to the classics, right? This is a phenomenon that affects the academic humanities in particular, has accelerated since the financial crisis at the very least, where you see more emphasis on, a college degree being expected to prepare you for a job above all, not to, study something you happen to be interested in, but a kind of pre-professionalizing attitude that drives decision making. That's actually pretty well documented, has hit history departments pretty hard, English, fields of that nature. So classics would be part of a larger problem of shrinking interest in a sense, or shrinking demand on the part of the student's body. And then of course you have a dialectical process, right? Because institutions can't fail to notice that and respond accordingly, and or already proactively buy into the whole professionalizing belief as well, and sort of almost, not just in response to lowered interest, but proactively reduce offerings in those fields because they perceive them as being less, quote unquote, useful than others, and would invest more resources in others that seem to be more closely tied to definable job opportunities going forward, which can be a really bad miscalculation, as we are now seeing with coding and AI and all the rest of it. So that's not a terribly sustainable strategy, but one that we have certainly witnessed now for some time. So it's a complex scenario, but it can't be reduced just to what happens in classics. It's a bigger problem.
Mhm. Thank you. And then another question I had. So I am a senior undergraduate student of classics, obviously looking at graduate applications now. Do you believe that the solutions for a lot of the issues that humanities and classics have is going to come from the private institutions, like in America and the United Kingdom, that have historically contributed the most scholarship and funding to classics, or do you think there's a shift towards public institutions like FSU, University of Colorado Boulder that have, yeah.
I see what you mean. Again, there's no single answer because it is often at less well-resourced public institutions that consolidation occurs, only that it's not driven by any kind of intellectual program. It's driven just by budgetary exigencies, right? Where some administrator says we must lump these departments together and cut a few jobs in the process and all the rest of it, because that's the only way for us to continue. That would be very different from certain public institutions in certain locales that would actively double down on a particular way of studying the ancient world for, any number of reasons. I think the well-resourced private institutions will be the last holdout, so to speak. Whether it's good or bad is really a matter of your taste. You could say it's a good thing. We have fully endowed positions that would be difficult, if not impossible, to remove or to use for other purposes. That creates continuity, ensures survival. It also, at the same time, there's always a trade-off, encourages adherence to the status quo for the sake of adhering to the status quo, right? I mean, it does impede any kind of more serious reconfiguration or consolidation. So it's a double-edged sword. But I think that in as much as classics as we know it is going to survive, it will be mostly at wealthy private institutions with endowed positions. And whether there's any kind of resurgence in the public education sector will very much depend, I think, ultimately on political dynamics.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Let's move on to Professor Borbouakis from Princeton. Emmanuel, nice to see you here.
Thank
What
you,
happened to
Jason.
him? Oh, there you
Am
are.
I-
Yeah, you
there
moved
we
on
are.
my screen. Yeah, there you
Yes.
go.
All right. Thank you to Professor Scheidel for a very thoughtful, very stimulating presentation. I would like to get your response to what might be the strong objection or the strong counter argument, namely that the case for Greco-Roman history is not that all histories are not equal, for which you marshaled some evidence from the 18th and early 19th century, but that not all histories are equally relevant at any given time and in any given context or venue. There are times when we may have to think of ourselves as co-inhabiting a planet or as a species. But when we think of most education, certainly at the secondary and post-secondary level, that's not the frame. So could you respond to this question about the fact that Greco-Roman history may need to be, let's say, ring-fenced in certain contexts and taught because it is the more relevant history for those contexts?
As I was trying to make clear, but probably not very well, is that, as I said, I mean, you can't have a plausible globalized ancient history without a prominent position for Greece and Rome, right? Nobody would want to move in a direction where the Greeks and the Romans are at risk of being cut while other ancient studies will be studied instead. It's not supposed to be a process of substitution. There may be some rebalancing in reality, given that funding is not unlimited, but it's certainly not meant to be a substitution. Maybe a bit of an idealist, which is very rapidly going out of fashion with the resurgence of nationalism and all the rest of it. But it would seem to me that if we live in an age that is more globally integrated than ever before, even though there are strong countercurrents now politically to that, it's still a fact. And we face problems that are planetary in nature, whatever you think of climate change and all that, but there are truly planetary scale problems. It would probably behoove people who study the more distant past to try to find ways to organize the teaching in particular, and to some extent, I think also academic study of that past in a way that reflects our current situation. I agree 110% of the complaints about presentism. I think that's a scourge in history departments. But one way of maybe I'm too optimistic about this, one way of counteracting this would be to say, look, we have so much more in common than you would necessarily realize if you just look at individual slivers of history. And that should in turn put us in a position to operate more as global citizens. Sounds hackneyed, but operate in a way that is a better fit for living in a globally integrated world and facing planetary scale problems. So this may sound very, high end and fancy and idealistic, but I really do think that there is almost like a moral component to that, that this is something we should certainly pay more attention to without, as I said, cutting out any important tradition. Whether that requires the extent to which this requires ring fencing, I think is the one thing that should be up for debate. Whether that requires a separate department, a separate program, or whether we should go more for deliberate full integration and see how that goes.
Thank you. I'm just going to jump in to ask a question, and then I'll move to you, Manu. So Walter, I just wonder whether this world of sort of integrated, collaborating global citizens might not be slightly too seeing the world and international politics at the moment with rather rose-tinted lenses in your glasses. So I recall again, Mr. Schmidt, former CEO of Google, stating emphatically there is a sort of arms race happening right now in the world. It's for who will reach super intelligence first. And it's really important that the West wins that arms race. And, Eric Schmidt is not a traditional right winger. He's not, he was in the Obama administration, not a cultural conservative. But if the leading technologists in the world right now are making that argument, and there is a set of values that they feel it is really, imperative that triumph in this context. Is it not incumbent upon educational institutions to kind of like forefront those values and say, this is where this comes from, and we stand for this as part of what it means to be an American, and to participate in our educational system? So it isn't sort of having a classics department a form of doing that? That's my question.
I think if I had written the book I talked about in 2000, people would have said, great idea, right? That's the direction the world is moving in. China is opening it up, all the rest of it, right? I've even in the years I was working on it, I became more and more painfully aware of the countercurrents, right? That I'm now in a way going against what is becoming a more and more powerful flow that is critical of this kind of, skeptical about it, and to some extent openly critical about this kind of globalizing approach and this various forms of integration with all the political backlash this has initiated. It is certainly true that the trajectory that China is on, that India is on, as well, arguably the US is on, at this point is not conducive, in a sense, to that kind of more globally integrated study, which I consider to be a great pity. So the question is, as an intellectual, should we sort of necessarily embrace this? Should we offer a counter position to that, even if it's maybe increasingly idealistic? I'm not seriously, but sort of almost half tempted to write another book, a sequel, where I argue the exact opposite, which you could also do, right? You could say we are entering a phase of renewed, big power competition. And in order to prevail, and it goes way beyond AI, right? In order to prevail, we should maybe double down on the most sort of, established forms of studying our so-called particular part of the world and so on. I identify at least one problem with this, because if you are a citizen of the United States in particular, and increasingly also European countries, but let's just stick to the US, what is your ancient history, right? I mean, what is your actual past? Is it automatically Greece and Rome because it plays a dominant role, has played a dominant role or an influential role in shaping certain institutions that govern life in this country? Or should we also pay attention to the ancestral tradition of all the people who make up the body politic of the United States, which by very soon will be majority non-white, and therefore by definition not originating in some system where Greece and Rome had always been the standard paradigm. It's very difficult to serve all these different needs, perceived or real, simultaneously, right? I think it is important to do justice to the genuine variety of ancestral traditions that come together in the United States, and also consider the world we live in and the direction we are moving. But my instinct, at least for the time being, would be to say it is ultimately through understanding other cultures alongside your own, however critically, that you will future-proof not just the academic field, but help future-proof your own society, right? A retreat from that, whether it's foreign language learning or engagement with the early histories of other parts of the world, would not seem to me to be the best way of ensuring the, whatever you want to call it, cultural resilience of any one country, including the US. So I see the problem, but my solution would be a different one.
Fair enough. Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and then I'll let everyone get on with their Sunday afternoon, morning, or evening, depending on where in the globalized planet you're joining us from. So, Manu, do you want to close us out? Oh, I think I have to ask you to unmute. Hold on one second. There we go. Did that work?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm a little bit unclear as to how this ideal department would actually look like, and how would graduate students be trained? I find that for the field that I study, which is late medieval Italian history, that my knowledge of Latin is really not as good as I would like it to be. I read French and German and Spanish, but there's secondary literature in so many different languages. How would a future scholar, in your vision, be trained to have competence that seems to be, I don't see a great deal of it in the program that I went to. And in fact, I was given a CAT-SAT on the Math Latin exam, which of course I passed, but I find that I don't have enough of the kind of philological expertise, I think, to be able to read primary sources in a very thoughtful and competent way. I don't think this is false humility on my part, but how exactly is this going to work?
So I have two answers to that. One is the cop-out answer, which is the fact that we don't know is a good thing, because it would force us to productively discuss the benefits and the trade-offs and the drawbacks of any such reform, which I think is an essential first step. I don't know what such a discussion might produce because we haven't had it. And I think it's very important to have it to begin with. And all these things would come up in this kind of productive discussion. So that's one part of the answer. The second one is that how do we define competences and skills? You can say philological competence is a skill and a competence, and it's very important. I agree. There are other competences that we currently don't try to nurture quite as much. I always tell my students, the first book you read about a culture you don't know anything about is way more important than the 50th or 500th book you read on the culture you have been studying a very long time, right? Because the learning curve is extremely steep, and you will almost immediately find inspirations that you will not necessarily receive from within your own field because of academic micro cultures and the skew of the evidence and any number of things. And that, I believe, is also a very, very important competence. And at the end of the day, we are humans. We can also only cram so much into our brains. And at some point, something has to give. We can't just add on stuff. We have to make decisions in a way. And some of these decisions were already made for us because people no longer do Latin prose composition in high school. If we did, we could then, read the documents with great ease once we're at university. It doesn't really happen anymore. So this happened a long time ago. I mean, I'm going to turn back time in that sense. I mean, Paideia Institute might turn back time some little extent in that regard. But, overall. So we are on a certain trajectory anyway. And I think we should maybe embrace more flexibility and openness in terms of what we define as core competences. And here, those that would arise from more a broader, more comparative globalizing approach are badly in need of an upgrade in terms of how we value them. That's all a part of an answer, but that's the best I can do at this point.
Thank you. Okay. Well, we've been at this now for 2 hours, or an hour and 15 minutes, rather. So I think we will adjourn until Thursday. I'd like to thank both Professor Scheidel and Professor Hankins for their interventions and for being here on Sunday for this very interesting discussion. And I hope many of you will return on Thursday. And if you want to debate whether we'll still need to read ancient languages in the future or not because of AI, we can do that offline as well, or pick it up on Thursday. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great Sunday, and thanks again to our speakers.